We're here to celebrate the exhibition Edward Hopper and Dike Blair, Gloucester, curated by Robert Hobbs. Tonight, we're so glad to have Dike Blair, who is a New York-based artist known for documenting quotidian, mostly American scenes since the 1980s. Dike has been showing with the gallery since 2015, and he is a much beloved member of the artist roster here. The organizer of the exhibition and author of the corresponding book, Robert Hobbs, is an art historian, curator specializing in 20th and 21st century art. Robert is the author of more than 50 books and major catalogs on topics ranging from Edward Hopper to abstract expressionism and earth art. Richard Prince is a New York-based artist whose practice ranges from bookmaking to photography to abstract painting. He is also an old friend of Dike's, and we are thrilled to have him here to share his insights this evening. Nancy Princenthal is a New York-based writer who has contributed to a plethora of artists' monographs, including Doris Salcedo, Robert Mangold, Gary Simmons, and Alfredo Jar. She is also a contributing editor to a number of art journals and periodicals, including Art in America, The New York Times, Hyperallergic, Bomb, Apollo, and others. Finally, Isabelle Dervaux, who will be moderating this evening, is the Acquavella curator and departmental head of modern contemporary drawing at the Morgan Library and Museum. The link between this exhibition and the Morgan Library will be elucidated in tonight's talk. And I'd just like to briefly thank the Whitney Museum of American Art for their generous loan of the Edward Hopper works. This exhibition would not have been possible without their support. So thank you again for attending, and now I'll hand it off to Isabelle. Thank you.
Is this on? Is this on? Okay. Good evening, and thank you, Sabrina, for the introduction. First, I want to congratulate Dike for this wonderful body of works, and also congratulate Rob for for conceiving and organizing this exhibition and for the splendid essay for the catalog. So, jumping in, Rob, do you want to tell us how the project was conceived, how it started?
Okay, I would love to. And first of all, I want to say, Dike is one of the nicest, most wonderful artists I've worked with. It has been an extraordinary pleasure, and I've also enjoyed working with everyone with the gallery. It's really been a terrific project. Can everyone hear me? And I'm holding this because I was told 5 minutes is what I have for this introduction. So I'll try to stay in, and I'm very impressed that all of you are here, and there are a few friends that I'm seeing in the audience, and thank you for coming. What I wanted to do with this project, and I met Dike in 2019, and he had realized the year before a relationship with Hopper, and I had done a book on Hopper in 1987, an Abrams book with the Library of American Art. And we started talking about our mutual interest in Hopper, and at first we thought about doing a show of looking at Dike's gouaches going back to the early 80s. And so I put together a slideshow, and then we realized we couldn't borrow a number of the pieces. We couldn't find a number of the pieces. And so Dike had the really brilliant idea of going to Gloucester, and because Hopper had done his first mature watercolors in 1923 in Gloucester. And so that was the ideal for the show, and it's what you see here. And I'm sure Dike will talk much more about what he was doing and the choices he made in terms of starting with photographs in Gloucester, because you can go there and there's a map of all the houses of Hopper and all of that. Dike asked me a different question. So I'm going to try to do that question. And he said, you know, in the book which accompanies this exhibition, I really undertake the idea to ask a question which surprisingly hasn't been asked. It's such a simple, basic question about Hopper. It's why the houses? Why was Hopper interested in the houses? And there were a number of reasons that have been given in the literature on Hopper. One is that Hopper was shy. He was 6 feet, 5.5 inches. He was socially awkward, so he felt more at home with houses than he did with people, so that's a reason for doing it. Well, that's one idea. Then there is another idea that he loved the houses he painted. He really wanted to revive interest in 19th century architecture. And so that's the reason he did it. And then the third is that Hopper's paintings of houses are so ubiquitous that they're everywhere. They're placeless. We don't need to deal with it. It's just part of the American scene. And so what I did in working on Hopper and trying to answer this question of why the houses, I started off with Emerson. And there was an Emerson centennial in 1903, and Emerson became very timely, and Hopper read and reread and read Emerson again and again. And Emerson, I went through all of Emerson's essays. It's quite fascinating. But Emerson really is fascinated with a particular kind of individuality. And this was one of my ideas for the show, is that we'd really look at two individuals, one from the early 20th century and a contemporary artist, Dike, and see how different they are. And Hopper was very much concerned with himself and his art. He said, it's all about me. I'm really searching for myself. And if you read Emerson, you start realizing exactly what that kind of self can be. It's very much a transcendental self, which goes back to Kant and goes back to the whole idea of how an individual serves as a distillery for the world around them, how they distill it. Dike made a wonderful comment wherein he talked about his interest in genres. And it's funny, if you look back over the last 50 years, say before 1950, the whole idea of studying genres and looking at them was considered very passé, very old-fashioned. There was no interest in it because they were found to be very limited. Think of a genre as a mystery story, a genre as science fiction. In literature, it's like a sonnet. And so what happened, and with structuralism and a study of poetics in the second half of the 20th century, is that genres became very timely. And it's one way of thinking about art from a postmodern point of view. I know postmodernism has been so debunked. But the thing about genres, to me, is it's a form of cognition. And that idea of cognition, it's a way of thinking about the world. And so the difference from Hopper wanting to distill things from his point of view and Dike looking in terms of genres is I like to think of it in terms of each genre becomes a type of software. So with Dike, it can be, ikebana, flower arranging, which you studied, very avant-garde form, or it can be haiku, or it can be, even Edward Hopper, as in this exhibition. So to answer the question, and I'll try to, again, be brief. I'm looking at my time. I've used it up almost, is that Hopper became very interested, he and his wife, in associationism. He would look at the houses and associate them with different personalities. So the whole idea of some of his Hopper's paintings is they became enigmas for he and his wife, Jo Hopper, and they would sort of try to figure out, well, what is this kind of situation, what this kind of personification? So they'd see an abandoned house like an old person. And so in 1936, let's see, in the journal it was described as quite pathetic, sitting out its old age with eyelids drooped. And what I found with Hopper's architecture is that I started going through literature, and houses are very important in American literature. You can think of, the house of, I made notes on it because I don't remember everything, but we can think of Uncle Tom's Cabin, we can think of Thoreau's Cabin, we can think of, a number of other, where pieces of literature where houses become states of mind. Rather than simply places. And this idea of associationism, I also looked at Babbitt, which was a best-selling book by Sinclair Lewis, and even though Hopper called him a fathead, if you start looking at certain descriptions of buildings, they're almost exact descriptions of Hopper paintings. And it turns out that the buildings that Hopper liked in the 1920s were so put down, so disliked, because people were really interested in progress and very new and innovative forms of architecture. So I should stop here.
Thank you, Rob. Yes, you'll have more chance to speak. I want to get back to the beginning of the project and the going to Gloucester. So Dike, first, once you had decided to work sort of in relation to Hopper, you could have picked New York, as we know from the show, or Paris. So why Gloucester? And then what happened when you went to Gloucester? Walk us through what happened that weekend.
Weekdays, but there were limitations which had to do with paperworks. So, I had Kim Levin's watercolor book, and I'm flipping through and going, why is he doing these things, and where are they? Oh, Gloucester. I can't find any of my paintings anywhere. So I figure, why not make some new ones? Gloucester, we're over by the Delaware River where Marie and I live, and we thought, let's get in the car and go to Gloucester. And we drove through Tropical Storm Henri, and arrived in, I don't know why not Henry, but we arrive in Gloucester, and it's beautiful. The light, post tropical storm. I'm not sure if Gloucester light is always that great, but it happened to be when we were there. Spent the first day with those maps of, Edward Hopper houses that were painted, and there, a kind of an incredible number of them still exist in, different states of repair and renovation. And I looked at them. We took photographs, and I was like, "Oh no, what can I bring to this?" And couldn't figure it out. Went back to the hotel, and had probably the really important Gibson and dinner, and went for a walk. And this is something I do when I'm in places. I go out at night and walk around, and the docks in Gloucester were phenomenal. I mean, just the number of different chemical lights, sodium vapor, mercury, all these different colors that I think you see in the nocturnes. And it was suddenly like, oh, dang, I can work with that. That almost looks like a Dike Blair or something, So, it was just kind of effortless. So then it got, well, it didn't get easy. It didn't get easy. It was just, I have a response, or I can be part of this conversation.
And so you took photographs. Did you make any drawings or paintings there?
No, nothing. I mean, a lot of photographs, which I kind of consider drawings. And then there's, editing, which editing is pretty significant, and scaling and all that stupid stuff. But it's all part of it.
Right. So we'll get back maybe to how you use the photography after, but I want to move to Nancy. You have in the past written insightfully about Dike's work. So what's your reaction to this new group of paintings?
A very happy reaction. It was fantastic to see this work.
Microphone. Can you use the microphone?
Mike. Fantastic to see the work, and nice to have a chance to talk with you all about it. So, I'm not a Hopper scholar. I'm going to talk as somebody who looks at work rather than from a really historical perspective. And it strikes me that the simplest thing to say about what this work is about is a relationship between painting and photography. I'm not going to dwell there because it's too both simple and big a subject. But to bring Hopper into it, we get to a place where we're thinking about originals, not only in terms of whether the painting or the photograph is an original, because of course Dike takes his own photographs, So they're the originals, but then there are also paintings which are another kind of conventionally defined sort of original. The Hopper project takes this question a little further into the area that's a little more uncommon, I think, which has to do with, what about this kind of head-on comparison? When does homage slip into challenge? When does challenge slip into, a kind of 20th century interpretation, 21st century interpretation of work that has been kind of displaced from its moment? What happens when all those changes take place? What are the kinds of feelings that arise with, or the kinds of intentions that drive those kinds of comparisons? I'm going to quote Peter Schuldel, late and lamented, who in 2021 said he saw a subtle air of ironic detachment in Dike's work, which I think is not, not much argument there. There is that air of subtle detachment, but it led me to wonder, what is that? How do we know it when we see it? What does it mean? It's like the word sentimental. We know it in a way that is very, very close to straight ahead kind of disparagement. We don't feel that way about irony, although we can. It's something very attached to the postmodern moment. So I was just wondering if it has any meaning, if we can determine that it's part of the visual, composition of the work. I am interested in the question of landscape in relationship to this show. Dike is a fan of Luminists, Fitzhugh Lane, John Frederick Kensett, Martin Johnson Heade, and you can see in his paintings that sort of, very, very precise degree of luminosity, this crystalline light. There are some other landscape painters out and about these days that are part of any landscape, cityscape painters background, even if they're not foregrounded. Alex Katz, of course, Raxra Downs, who wrote in 1981, instead of being a way of using painting to look at nature, Raxra started as an abstractionist, it was for him a way of using nature to force on yourself a fresh way of looking at painting. And I thought, I'm not sure that's true of what Dike does, but I thought, some kind of related negotiation goes on, using the world to sort of refresh the screen. I noticed that, much like Raxra Downs' work, if we're calling this a genre of landscape, it's a landscape without much of the natural world at all. There's very little greenery. That kind of circles back to this question of the photographic. Landscape, of course, was invented as a form by painting in, basically the late 16th, 17th century. And now we know it like we know every bit of the visual world through photography. So it circles back to, what is the origin point here? Dike said in an interview with Steele Stillman in 2009, so that's a while ago now, the gouaches got me thinking about the possibility of reinventing landscape by injecting it with televisual and cinematic effects, which I would love to hear more about. But it does sort of support this notion that the relationship is with photography as much as it is with the natural world. He also, in the same interview, Dike told Steele, the painted line on the highway must be the most ubiquitous landscape painting in the world, which I just love so much that I had to say it. I love that idea of the line on the highway as a landscape painting. And of course, there's a connection there, as I see it, to cinema, to the landscape sort of unspooling like a film. Just a couple of other things I want to say about the landscape connection. There's the issue of light, which Dike, you already brought up. There is very little sunlight here. But there's an incredible wealth of artificial light from the sulfur lights and the halogen lights and the vehicle lights and street lamps, toxic light, poisonous light pollution, I think is part of what's going on here. And the net result for me was that Hopper, who we think of as being a very chilly kind of guy, seems almost warm. You know, he's got this milky atmosphere and the humid, salty air that you can see, the warmish sand, which, by contrast, shows us what it's like to be in Gloucester in the 21st century. There's not even much water. You know, Gloucester is an ocean-facing city. There's almost, you know, we have our back to the water in almost every picture. I'm thinking particularly of that great big mansion with the black pickup truck in front, and this very teasing painting, Dike's painting, where you think, there's water, but no, actually it's a very vivid blue shadow in the sand. We still have our back to the ocean, which I think is just curious. It's, you know, it's a relationship to what kind of information a painting based on a photograph can provide. I want to make a couple comments also about the absence of people. Of course, Hopper painted a lot of people, but this is a quote from Mark Strand on Hopper. He formalizes privacy by giving it a space where it can be witnessed without being violated. And I think I kind of see that in Dike's paintings as well. The sort of closed down buildings, there's very little access. I'm also interested in the intimate scale. You know, I mean, you could say that they're scaled to photographs, but as anyone who's seen the William Eggleston show knows, there is no longer a scale of, I mean, you know, that goes back and back, but I'm saying even for photographs that were originally meant to be seen small, they're now, you know, mural size. So, you know, the sense of both intimacy and inaccessibility is, I think, really interesting connection to Hopper. And lastly, and Robert, this came up in your discussion of Ikebana and also in your essay in the discussion of structuralism and the relationship in Dike's work throughout to arrangement, you know, to curating as a kind of art form, and that goes for sort of hybrid work that Dike made that involves paintings as well as sort of furnishings. And many of those furnishings included carpeting and electrical wires. So you know, I'm going to take a flyer on the idea of connections and disruptions, and there's so many wires in these paintings. And there are a few in Hopper's, you know, telegraph wires as well. But the wires, which, you know, have been in sculpture as real things, now appear as images, and I think kind of materialize this interest in connection. So that's about it for me.
Thank you, Nancy, and you brought a lot of important points. Some of them we will certainly go back to. But Richard, now from the point of view of someone who has been a friend of Dike for decades now, what is your reaction to these new works?
Well, I think Dike and I met around 1980. Dike and I think we met around 1980, so we've known each other a long time. I was reminded before we came here, we spent some time on Shelter Island together on the North Fork. We rented houses together. And there's a certain, the thing that I think that they both share is a sense of exaggerated reality. And I guess this exaggerated reality could be something that's what they're both surrounded with. What's next door to them is already in them, I think that if there's something hidden in a simple window pane, and if you paint that windowsill, are you complementing it, or are you setting it free into a kind of a living experience, a form of transcendentalism, like the song says. The artist just wants to take you higher, and I think for both of these artists, I think it's just things that they like to paint. It's that simple. I know Dike and I have all share this affinity for empty houses, abandoned houses that sit in fields of grass that have not been mowed, and it's almost as if these scenarios. I mean, what are we attracted by? What is it about an empty house that attracts us? And it's a subject that it's almost a subject that you want to be part of, that you want to be, and maybe you become a bit more part of it after you paint it. It's a form of recognition, something that's slightly strange, but becomes very animated after staring at it for a number of hours. And is this pedestrian type of subject matter, can you elevate it by just concentrating, by looking at it? I think the difference between Dike and Hopper, I think, is that his subject matter is loaded with cultural information, and I think Dike has already explained that. And the other question is does it take, what kind of courage does it take to make Gloucester into your subject? I mean, it's a very interesting concept. And I think I'm also in this very these images are a kind of hybrid of drama and documentation at the same time, I find. And that hybrid creates a tension between the subjective and the objective, and interior, exterior, fact and fiction. And it's almost like what it imagines, and I think this has more to do with Dike, is his medium. It's almost like a voiceover from a late 50s noirish movie. The provocative ordinariness of the imagery. But I guess the only thing that I could possibly contribute tonight is that I'm in this very strange position of I've lived in the same room with a Hopper and Dike Blair's for, 15 years. And All I have to really say about that is that when I look at the hopper, the word cakey comes to mind. It's the only way I can really describe it. And that has a lot to do with the surface of the paint. And then when I look at Dike, I get this feeling of it. It's like his paintings are kind of like velvet nightclubs. So that's about it.
Okay, so Dike, now of course, what do you think of those comparisons or those terms to describe your paintings?
Of course, I'm flattered. I did one of the things I think you were talking about, unoccupied buildings or emptiness and all of that, and it always comes up with Hopper where people say, "Oh, he paints loneliness." It's not lonely; it's solitude, and solitude is for an artist kind of a gorgeous thing, and I think that's kind of another way of saying what you were saying.
Yes, Rob.
I'd like to add something. When you think about your comment about being interested in genres, if we look at the work, the third one over with the deep blue sky and the fence and the seawall, in terms of genres, I think what's very important for Dike, for your work, I can speak for you as art historians are frequently prone to do. I know you collected comic books for years, and there's an interest in saturated color. I also know you're very interested in Japanese culture. And also, it seems to me that photography plays a role. So if we look at a work like that, I can see layering of different genres coming together in a piece like that. Whereas if we look at the Hopper to the left of it, Hopper's individuality seems to be such that he is presenting us with a composition that is in the act of being orchestrated and pulled together. And it's both assembling forms. You look at the foreground, and he's assembling forms. And then if you go up and you look at it closely, there's a certain amount of dissembling forms. So there is this kind of tension between creation and sort of separation and falling apart. Whereas I see what Dike is doing is very much a picture. It is a finished composition that is very much orchestrated and pulled together. And that seems to me to be a very clear difference between the two.
Dike, I wanted to ask you something which, when you look at all the paintings around, there is one obvious difference between Hopper's works and yours, is that all the Hoppers are horizontal and almost all your works are vertical. Mm. So I was wondering, what was the, did you didn't want to do something horizontal?
My format veers toward the vertical forever.
Why?
I don't know. I've got astigmatism, you know. Me and El Greco.
Because the landscape, the landscape format is traditionally horizontal also. So is that part of the new kind of different kind of landscapes that you want to do? Or?
Again, it's more intuitive than rational, but I mean, you look at ukiyo-e, and much of that landscape is vertical. It's a natural attraction. Yeah.
Fair enough.
Well, I mean, yeah.
So perhaps before we go to more interpretations, a little more technical, practical. How do you use the photography? You use Photoshop. What do you do with the material that you brought back from Gloucester?
You saw, I don't know how many, I had maybe, I'm not sure, 1,000 pictures or whatever. And, I kind of go through them and select what I think would make a good painting. And when I'm taking my pictures, I'm not I'm at this point, after painting from photography for a long time, I'm taking pictures thinking about paintings, not thinking about photographs. So, and then I go through what might almost be a magazine editor process of selecting collections of images that might both speak to and contradict each other. I'm keeping in mind, like, if I do, 4 paintings of that particular kind of nocturne, I'm going to bore myself out of my mind. So I try to, I work on a number of things at the same time, and I want to make sure that each one needs or requires different technical approaches. Okay, so then I arrive at, let's say I arrive at 6 images that I'd like to work on. They're all projected. Well, first I print them out. I try to figure the scale. I do Photoshop. I do some distortion and try to lens correct and all this stuff. And then I do printouts to make sure, and that's not evident, but the difference between 28 by 21 and 24 by 18 ends up for me being important. Is it? I don't know. Then I project and do a very faint blue pencil outline, and then I start using gouache, and gouache is very forgiving because it can be opaque. And Hopper doesn't have the luxury of going back in his paintings a zillion times. They'd be a disaster. I need the disaster to build the history in the surfaces and the pigment. It's almost like dyeing the paper.
What do you mean by disaster?
Well, you can't watercolor over something too much before it turns into mud,
But yours don't turn into mud.
Well, they're not watercolor, they're gouache. That's what I was trying to distinguish, that gouache is more generous that way, and I just like it, So there's kind of, history in the layers of not getting there and not getting there, and then, starting to get there. So.
Can I ask a question with respect to exactly what you're talking about? So this...
With the microphone, please.
Oh, did this again. With respect to what you're talking about, this painting in the corner, that is like mostly about a street. The street has the most remarkable texture. And I thought, how the heck do you do that with gouache? Maybe, and this isn't the first time I've thought this, I don't really know what gouache is, in comparison to watercolor. So can you talk a little bit about how you get these amazingly precise textures and quality of light?
I paint like most people, kind of back to front. So that sky, everything else, I'd kind of mask off everything and paint the sky. And how many tries did that sky take? It took a number of tries. Then I start to build. Anyway, the street, the road is kind of the last thing. And one of the things I do with skies and everything there's this tool that some people might know, Prevol spray paints. They use it for auto body touch-ups and stuff, and it's basically an aerosol thing. Let's say this is the thing, and you can put it in a jar of paint you've mixed and go pss, 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 and then you stroke it out. You can do lots of stuff. I think in that case, I was taking old toothbrushes and going like that, and then you don't get it, you don't get it.
The normal stuff.
And then, I don't know. Well, and then you get it,
I don't want to pry,
Well,
trade
these are,
secrets, but it's such a living thing that, so many of the passages of light or simple surfaces become so alive.
the pleasures, of course, is getting any, when any one of them get resolved in a way that you can say, I don't think I can do that better if I do it again. Well, and then you've already messed it up a couple times by trying to make it better. You know, and again, painters all over the place here. You know, it's done when you can't make it any better.
In fact, you say they are very alive and all, but it seems to me that the paintings are very, there's a lot of fantasy, imagination in there more than reality. In the Hopper watercolors feel more real, and yours more unreal, more almost surrealistic.
Let me say, in terms of Hopper's watercolors, they were all made in front of the motif, and they were all made out of doors. So he was working with natural light. So he didn't have the opportunity to go back, as you're talking about with gouache. And I think you explained to me sometimes with the sky, to get that intense blue you have, you would go through 6 times to get the saturated color that you really want. One of the things, following up on the fantasy, that delighted me when I first saw a whole series of the works in the show was how playful you are in terms of color. So that there are certain passages, if you go up close and you look, they're like little jewel-like areas of just splashes of color that is such a delight. Now, is that something that came from the photograph, or is this something that you were more playful in doing? Because you give the viewer a lot to enjoy and savor. That's basically what I'm saying.
You know,
in terms of color.
I'm entertaining myself
Okay.
first and foremost. You're
Good.
second on the list.
Yeah. Well, at least I'm up there. Yeah.
No, sometimes something, the most wonderful thing is when something synergetic happens in terms of paint and light, and you kind of go, oh, and it's not, and, that's not in all of these or very often, but when it does happen, it's, you feel good, or I feel good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and your viewers do also.
Richard, do you have any questions for Dike about whatever?
Do you find the application of whether it's watercolor or gouache, you obviously are so familiar with the medium, and when you say the idea of enjoyment or a pleasure, it also reminds me of a kind of a sensuality. I think the idea of dipping a brush half loaded with water-based paint into a cup of water and then putting the brush to the paper, and things happen on their own. Even though you might be the one gathering the paint, dipping the paint, dragging the brush across a particular type of paper too. I mean, you obviously are very well aware of the craft, whether you're using cold press, hot press, the way the water, the gouache rises or disappears into the paper, the stain. I mean, you must like all that, but you've also, I think, because I have a little bit of inside information about the idea of you use inkjet, and so I wonder where does the inkjet come in terms of what step is it in terms of the process? Or is it?
Inkjet. I mean, I do inkjet printouts.
Yeah.
So I have basically a big, picture of the lighthouse. But there's no inkjet in. I was talking about the Prevol spray. So there's spray in it that has a relationship to photography and stuff because it speckles and it. But there's no computer.
But it's.
Stuff
I mean, I
in
guess
it.
what I'm saying is it's a pretty nice way to spend the day, by yourself, alone in the studio, without anybody around, and watching this particular medium happen.
No, it's really fun to build them, and and again, there's some, occasionally a stillborn, but for the most part, every one of these, I'm like, I can't paint that, and then it's like, oh maybe, and then there's the turnaround, and there's toward the end when it gets really fun, where you can start doing lighting effects and things like that. I mean, it's after all these. I do know somewhat what I'm doing after decades, but it's still really like I still don't know that I can do it. I don't know what that means, other than it's no. I never go out to the studio and go, okay, I got to finish that painting. It's always kind of interesting.
It seems from what you say that one of the challenges for you is how to make it look like a photograph. It's the effect that you see in the photograph that you are most interested in reproducing with the gouache.
In part, I mean, but I'm also in all of these. I know exactly what I was feeling when I was standing there taking the picture. I mean, I know what I.
But how much do you improvise?
Very, very little. I mean, unless there are happy accidents, but very little. Again, I'm not. I mean, strictly speaking, it's photorealism, but it's got nothing to do with photorealism. It has to do with painting, as far as I'm concerned.
Right. That's actually an interesting question that we may ask, maybe from Nancy as an art historian, or from Rob. How would you describe the difference between a Dike Blair painting like this and a photorealist, let's say Robert Bechtel, because he also does those cars in the streets, or what makes them different?
I wanted to talk about something that is adjacent, but not quite that. So I'm going to struggle with that for a moment. I think there was a lot more of a kind of spectacle in that sort of early Advent photorealism. Just a celebration of the effects that could be achieved in terms of texture and reflection. And I think there's something else going on here that is, and partly because we're a couple decades in from that particular genre, and less interested in the kind of wondrous photorealism of Bechtel, for instance, or Richard Estes, and it goes to this difference in how these were constructed. Unlike so much of Hopper's work, as I understand it, where memory is said to play so much of a role. So another thing that's said about Hopper is that the reason the light feels in his work like it adheres to the surfaces rather than being in the atmosphere is because he's reconstructing it from memory and building a painting. And here, because he's working in plein air, he's not doing that. We're seeing something that really is a reflection of a moment. And oddly enough, especially since we know more about how slow this process that Dike is involved with is. There's more memory, it seems to me, in making these paintings, these photorealist, in some sense, paintings, than in, Hopper's watercolors. And I mean, I guess that's something I'm interested in. Do you think that painting is a significant part of the way these things come together? And is there, I guess I'm saying, is there a distance between what you saw?
I mean, I go for intimacy. To me, they're intimate, unlike photorealists that wanted the exact opposite, which was not intimacy. Yeah. So I don't. While I'm fascinated by photorealists, I don't think this has anything to do with it. Yeah.
I would like to ask a question. And Dike has mentioned to me that when you were an undergraduate, you were very impressed by Nabokov's book, Fenin. And there's a description of advice to a young painter. Would you talk about that and how mediation is so very important to you rather than any kind of straightforward realism or straightforward empiricism?
Big Richard as well. We're Nabokov fans, and when I was kind of reading and studying Nabokov when I was a freshman in college, and it just grabbed me. But Nabokov would have contempt for any of the art that I would be looking at in my contemporary art history class at the time, and I kept going, God, how can this possibly reconcile? And there's a really wonderful little passage in Penin where he talks about it's his stepson or something, and he has a teacher. I forget the details, but he's basically painting tree branches reflecting on a car hood with shadows and with this kind of complexity of representation that it just sunk in. I mean, I didn't use it for decades. It's a nice passage.
No. I think about when I look at the mansard roof house in the corner with the pickup truck. It just reminds me of the description in the book about the black sedan and how a landscape is broken up in a number of reflections. And it seems to me that you're picking up with a number of these reflections if we sort of look around the room with various gouaches that you've done, that light and light reflected is very important.
Oh, yeah, no. Yes.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question also about possibly expanding on this notion of the cinematic in the work?
I want to think of something smart to say, but depending on which, it changes with different bodies of work. I mean, the still lives are really different. You look at my dashboard things and highways. That's of course real, very, totally cinematic. And there are always these moments, these kind of interstitial moments that I like. I also tend to, look at, like, I think, again, I'm not the first to watch movies and subtract all the human beings and say, boy, that looks really good. And I confess at looking at a bunch of hoppers and wanting to remove the human beings. But I mean, not that they should be, just that inclination. I think they're cinematic, or have, like we all have,
But you're not imagining this as a filmic
narrative
situation. This, that there's cells going on here, or frames.
No.
Are there any other questions among the panelists? If not, maybe we can.
I just have a question about the idea of, again, the Gloucester. I associate immediately with a kind of a daytime type of situation or town, and it's obvious that there's a lot of nocturnal scenes. Can you? I think there's.
There are a bunch of stuff where I'm really talking to Hopper. The seawall with the house peak. We know a Hopper house peak. Some kind of thing of that. I went to the Eastern Lighthouse a couple times to take pictures because he painted it. So there was this sort of, okay, what will I do with what he did? And it's not coincidental that those are both day pictures. But when again, that first night in Gloucester, when I walked down to the docks and identified with this is something that Dike Blair might paint, and so Dike Blair painted it.
That's exact. Dike Blair not only might, but he should.
And he
the
did.
Gas station. And I was also just reminded, because when you were talking about the pickup truck, and I was reminded of Paterson, New Jersey, that essay, the photographic essay by George Tice. And he has really one very famous photograph of a gas station. And there's a particular car that's parked in front of the gas station. And the cars mean something to people who know nothing about art. It means something culturally. It triggers these associations. And I was wondering about that pickup truck, and was it there? Is it chance? Were there any other choices? Or was that a specific, when you walking that evening?
I took a bunch of Haskell's house pictures, daytime and nighttime, and that was the best nighttime. And I saw, the Tacoma, and I've been looking at pickup trucks for the last 6 months and obsessing a little bit. So, so I saw that.
Perfect sense.
Yeah, but when I often, I think about, your work, that you address that stuff. I think, you tap right into the vein. I tend to go back at it, different kind of romanticization, a little more, I don't know, not sentimentality, but romantic. We both like Marlboros, but you went deep into the American psyche with Marlboros, and I'm like, oh, I just want to smoke that cigarette, So, so there's some, but it's the same, similar turf, yeah.
So was the pickup truck there, or did you add it?
No, I don't. I remove, but I don't insert.
You don't? Okay.
No.
And the idea of choosing the night also is, I assume, is because that way the light is artificial, so you have more freedom to do what you want with it, isn't it?
I'm just attracted to artificial light, yeah. And I like nocturnes. I've painted a lot of nocturnes.
One of the things I love about this painting of Haskell's house, Hopper did 3 versions of it. One is in the National Gallery, one's in the Art Institute of Chicago. We reproduced the one in the National Gallery in the book, is that Hopper looked at it, he thought it was a captain's house, he fascinated about it. The second mansard roof house is the type of architecture in the 1920s that was really hated. One writer in a garden magazine described them as excrescences on the landscape. And what I think is so fascinating is Hopper really was interested in the house. When I look at it, I love the piece. I think about the pickup truck. It really competes very much. So it becomes like a 21st, century version of what's important. And of course, the house is no longer painted the same color. There are a number of changes to it that you record. But the fact that that pickup truck there is just glowing, you know, and it reminds me of the Nabokov book and the story about the black sedan.
Are there any questions in the audience? Do we need a microphone, maybe? Because there's a question here on the front row.
Did you get it, Tacoma? I have it. Yes.
Can you
But
ask
it's-
again with the microphone?
Did you get a Tacoma? I got a white Tacoma, regular cab, but it's not four-wheel drive, 2014, from Carvana.
It's going to appear in one of your
Yeah.
paintings. Any other questions? Yes.
I'm interested in what you find inspiring about ukiyo-e, about images of the floating world.
I didn't hear the question.
the-
Can you
the-
repeat it?
I'm sorry.
No.
I'm a traditional Asian art historian, so I'm interested in your inspiration from ukiyo-e, which is images of the floating world for those who don't know Japanese woodblock prints.
Yeah.
Good question.
I'm not sure if you know Jim Lee, comic book artist, and it's just so influential from French modernism to now. They're undeniably fabulous. I'm not sure I have any insight that nobody else has had, but I have a collection, and do I ever do? I mean, the whole Hopper thing. I've never done a one-to-one anything like this, so I can't compare this to anything. But I can go, I did paintings of comic books that I think keep alive that tradition that I admire.
Yes, there's another question. You have a microphone here? Oh, okay. In the back first. Then we go back.
Hi. Thanks for this. I love, it's just wonderful to see these. Hi, Dike.
How are you?
I kind of like the way you, not dispatched with Hopper, but you kind of had the intuition to go to Gloucester and sort of did due diligence and painted 2 landmarks and then found your own stuff. But you've also painted paintings where you actually include a painting in your painting. And I'm wondering how these 2 different relationships to an artist you love might play in your head, or if it did at all, or if this was just another moment.
Not unrelated, and I have some potential Hopper paintings that I could paint, because this is so much fun when you basically forge somebody's work. But this I wasn't. Well, one exception was Marie. I posed Marie. Hopper did this funny painting at Good Harbor Beach, which is the beach where both of these houses are, and he did a portrait of his wife Jo, and poor Marie. I made her pose sketching. It's not here because it wouldn't have worked here, but it's in Robert's book. If
Yes,
you get
it's
Robert's book.
reproduced.
I
Yeah.
That's an incentive.
Do you want to bring the microphone up front here? But I think it's...
Yeah, I was just curious, because Gloucester's by the sea, the importance of humidity at night and artificial light. It definitely has a completely different chemistry and effect.
Yeah.
It seems that would be
Good point.
Well, and I mentioned earlier that we arrived there right after a tropical storm,
Correct.
when it was the perfect combination of, crystal clear night sky with water on every asphalt surface. So that was super active. I mean, maybe that far painting over there that I think is Marie's picture was a morning picture where the, fog, where it hasn't burned off yet. But the nights were kind of crystalline, at least for the few nights that I was there. Yeah.
Interesting.
My question is actually geared towards both artists that are on the panel, and it's kind of a more general question about being influenced by other artists, like whether it's conceptual or technical. Like clearly the series is very heavily mediated through the work of another artist, but I'm kind of mesmerized by artists' ability to be in dialogue with artists throughout history or their contemporaries, and I wonder if you could both just speak a little bit to that dialogue that you have with other artists.
I wish we had a picture of the collaboration we did about Paul's Lounge, which was an East Village bar that we used to frequent.
I remember that collaboration, You go first in terms of...
Well, we all, I think about your work always. I think about so many people's work. I'm sorry, I'm not giving a very insightful answer. I mean, an artist who doesn't look at other art, there's no such thing, I wish I could do better. Richard?
Richard.
There's a million, but recently, I would say, just recently I've been looking at early Louise Bourgeois drawings. I've been looking at drawings by very well-known artists like that they did very early on. Maybe even when they were students, like Ellsworth Kelly. I just saw a drawing of a sneaker that he did in like 1949 or something like that. Yeah, so, and I think I was just having a conversation last week about Sigmar Polka with a gentleman who knew him, and we were just talking about, I got to know him a little bit before he passed away, and I was always a great admirer of the way he would not necessarily reinvent himself or change. He just seemed like the kind of artist that would get up in the morning and perhaps one thing led to another, and he would hopefully be surprised by the end of the day, that kind of thing. He wasn't, artists that aren't necessarily pinned down by a particular type of style. I like, but that being said, there's a great many artists that I collect who have nothing but signature styles, like a Morandi. There's a gentleman, William Bailey, and I just, this is again about, it's not necessarily such an influence, but this mania, this kind of like, I have this unfortunate Jones for collecting, and it seems like there's not a week past that I'll look at someone like Martin Dissler, who's a Swiss artist who's who was born the same year I was, but passed away very early, and I hadn't thought about him in a long time, and acquired one of his works recently, and a guy named Lester Johnson, who I've become interested in again. But it's mostly artists that I was introduced to when I was around 19 or 20, before I came to New York, that still sort of hold some sort of thing over me.
Before we conclude, I have one more question. Did this group of work inspire, or what did it inspire for you afterward? Did you want to do more works based on other artists? Do you want to do more landscapes? I mean, what's the next step based on these?
Well, I'm working on some oil paintings, so, you know, I love gouache. I find oil very challenging. I'm working on some oil paintings that are unrelated. I'm thinking a fair amount. These are a kind of focal step back from what I've been kind of collapsing the distance between the subject and, you know, the viewer, and these were a pullback, and I'm trying to figure out whether I want to stay pulled back or whether I want to go back in. It's not, you know, not so interesting.
What I mean is that this experience did not inspire something particular to do after.
Not to do after. I mean, it was very inspiring and fun. I mean, I really loved this project, and it was a little under a year of doing these paintings, and I totally enjoyed. I mean, you know, when you're told, oh yeah, you're going to have a painting hanging next to a Hopper painting, it gets you out of bed, you know.
Sounds good. Any other comments? Great. Well, thank you very much for coming.